Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a tragic and really complex Supreme Court case, People versus Dalag. Now, this isn't just about legal jargon. It's a story of how our justice system had to piece together the truth of a brutal crime where the only eyewitnesses were the victim's own young children. So, to really get a handle on how the court arrived at its decision, we're going to walk through this just like a lawyer would. We'll start with the basic facts. Then we'll zero in on the main question the court had to answer. After that, we'll look at the final ruling and then dig into the why, the court's reasoning, and the legal principles that ultimately led to the final judgment. You know, every court case really starts with a story. So let's begin with the events of August 15th, 1996. It was an evening that ended with the tragic death of Leah Nalado Dalag. We'll look at exactly what happened, and then we'll get into the two completely different versions of that story that were told in court. Okay, so the night kicked off around 8 p.m. with the sound of arguing. But what their children, Francis and Princess Joy, saw next, well, that became the very cornerstone of this entire case. Their mother, Leah, was found unconscious later that night. She lay in a coma for a whole week, but tragically, she never woke up. Just like that, a domestic dispute escalated into a homicide investigation. Now, this is what makes this case so fascinating from a legal standpoint. You've got two stories that absolutely cannot both be true. The prosecution, relying on what the kids said, painted a picture of a brutal, violent assault. But the defense? They claimed it was all just a terrible accident, that Leah simply tripped and fell. One story is a crime, the other is a tragedy. The court's entire job was to figure out which one was the truth. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the powerful testimony of the victim's own children. Her son Francis, who was just 11 years old, gave this graphic, horrifying account of the assault. He described in detail how his own father, who was a police officer by the way, repeatedly hit his mother. Just imagine the weight of that in a courtroom, a young boy testifying against his own parent. All right, so with two completely different stories on the table, the whole case really boiled down to one single critical question for the court to answer. This was it. This was the absolute heart of the matter. The father, Armando Dalag, claimed his children were lying. He said their grandfather had coached them and that their testimony was totally fabricated. This put the court in an incredibly tough spot. Who do you believe? A police officer or his own two young children? They had to decide whose version of that awful night was real. So, after weighing these two conflicting accounts, the father's claim of a tragic accident versus his children's story of a vicious attack, what did the court finally decide? The verdict was clear and decisive. The Supreme Court backed up the lower court's decision and upheld the conviction. Armando Dalag was found guilty. The court was sending a message. This was no accident. This was a crime. But look, a guilty verdict is one thing. Understanding why the court came to that conclusion, that's everything. This is what lawyers call the ratio decidendi. It's the core legal reasoning behind the decision. And the Supreme Court's decision here really stood on two unshakable pillars that completely supported the children's story. So that first pillar was the court's complete belief in the children's testimony. They found Francis and Princess Joy to be candid and straightforward, saying they described what happened in a way that's characteristic of people telling the truth. The court also reasoned that kids that young would have no reason, no motive, to make up such a horrible story. And there's another thing. Testimony against a close blood relative is given special weight because it goes against every natural human instinct. The children's story was incredibly powerful, for sure. But was it enough on its own? The court needed something more, something objective, physical evidence that could either back up their story or tear it down. And this is where the case goes beyond what people said and into the world of hard science. And that brings us to the second huge pillar of the court's reasoning, the medical evidence. The neurosurgeon who attended to Leah, a Dr. Canto, he was suspicious right from the get-go. He testified that her injuries, we're talking black eyes, hematomas, even what looked like finger marks on her neck, they just didn't line up with the story of a simple fall. He actually suspected she had been strangled. And when the final autopsy report came in, it was damning. It listed contusions, abrasions, and a scalp hematoma all over Leah's body. The official cause of death was an intracranial hemorrhage from a blunt injury to the head. The court was blunt, calling the father's story of an accident illogical and a poor concoction of facts. It was that 1-2 punch. The credible testimony from the kids, plus the medical proof that backed them up, that proved to be absolutely decisive. So once guilt was established, the court's next job was to apply the letter of the law. This meant they had to precisely define the crime and then figure out what the right punishment should be. The specific crime was identified as parricide, which is defined under Article 246 of the Revised Penal Code. This isn't just murder. It's a specific type of killing where the victim and the killer have a close family relationship. The most important element to prove is that relationship. And in this case, the prosecution locked that down by presenting Armando and Leah's marriage certificate. Next up, the court had to look at any mitigating circumstances. These are basically factors that could potentially lessen the sentence. The court did accept one. Armando Dalag did eventually surrender to the police, but they totally rejected his second claim, that he acted out of passion and obfuscation. And this is a really critical point. The defense actually argued that Armando was agitated and angered because Leah didn't immediately run out and get medicine for his foot after he stepped on a nail. The Supreme Court called the lower court's acceptance of this argument a travesty. They ruled that Leah running away wasn't some unjust act. It was a desperate attempt to survive a merciless beating. To blame a victim for trying to save her own life, the court essentially said, is just fundamentally wrong. And that brings us to the very end, the disposition of the case. This is the court's final official order that makes the verdict real and enforceable. With the crime established as parricide and one mitigating circumstance applied, the law was pretty clear. Armando Dalag was sentenced to reclusion perpetua. Here in the Philippines, that is a very severe sentence. It's basically life imprisonment, though the technical range is from 20 to 40 years. On top of that prison sentence, the final judgment had this tragic, almost unbelievable irony. Armando Dalag was ordered to pay financial damages, a total of 100,000 pesos, directly to the two children whose testimony had just put him behind bars. The case of People versus Dalag is, without a doubt, a heartbreaking story, but it's also a powerful example of our justice system at work. And it leaves us with this very difficult question. When your family is both the witness and the victim, how does the law even begin to weigh the truth? As this case shows us, sometimes the search for justice depends on listening to the quiet, clear voices of its smallest victims.